Hello and welcome back to our series on creating a Python app to extract data from Jira. Today we are going to create our project, start coding. We will be importing some libraries, defining some variables to configure everything for our environment, and then we'll write our first function which logs into Jira for us and gets back the JSession ID that we can use to authenticate our future requests. So let's get started. The first thing for us to do is to start up a Jupyter notebook. So I'll go to Start, Anaconda, and Jupyter Notebook. And that will get things kicked off, get us a development environment to work within in a minute. There we go. Now we have my desktop available here. And there's the Python folder that I've created. And that's where I want to do my work. So in this folder, I'm going to create a new notebook. And there we go. Now the first thing I'm going to do is rename this as Jira Extract. That will rename the whole notebook. I'll explain some of the Jupyter foo that I'm doing here as I go. The first thing I'm going to do, the nice thing about Jupyter here is that we can enter markup and code, and it'll execute the code we enter here and give us the results below it, and then keep executing on top to bottom like that. So first thing I'm going to do is add some markup here. I am going to escape 2. That makes a heading 2. Escape enters command mode, and then a 2 says I want a heading at the second order. And I'm going to say import libraries. And then B to give me myself a new line, and I'm going to import some libraries. So the first library I think I want to import is requests, and that's for requests, responses, cookies, the basic things we'll be doing with the HTTP stuff. Requests. Oh, don't need a semicolon after that. Next thing, we know we're going to be working with JSON. We're going to be passing it in as a request. We're going to be getting it back, so I'm going to import the JSON library. And then once we do have our result back, we're going to want to convert that into CSV format, and I'm going to use pandas to do that because it makes it fairly straightforward. Actually, a one-liner. So I'll take pandas. And then one other thing I like to do is timestamp all the files that I create. So I'm going to import time and import date time. And time and date time together will give me a nicely formatted string to throw into my file names to timestamp them. So next step, let's see, escape B, a new line. I'm going to call this configuration. So I'll make it a 2, heading 2, and that will be configuration. I'm going to put all of my configuration variables up here at the top so that you can easily modify it for your environment. And the first thing I'll do is add the URLs that we'll be using to connect. Now I'm going to, so we'll split these URLs into 2 parts, because the first part, the longer part, will be used by all the APIs that we call. It represents the protocol, the server address, the port, and the basic path to REST Jira services. And I can get that from here, most of it from here. So I'm going to go up to Jira. Whoops. I'm on a Windows machine. Let's see, there we go. Copy, and back to my notebook. I'm going to call this base URL, and it equals, again, on a Windows machine. I can't do paste like that. There we go. So that's the beginning of it. It's almost all of it. Now, after this, instead of going to the website, we want to add /rest. And you know what? I'll put a / at the end of that. So we'll be concatenating other things onto this. I don't want to have to put a / at the beginning of everything. So that's the base URL that all of our APIs request. So let's throw in some APIs. First, I'm going to put in the login API path. We need that, and it is auth1 session. Oops, did I use double quotes? Okay, auth1 session. So we'll append this onto the end of our base URL to get the full path to the login API. Now, I said we're going to call some other APIs in this thing besides my company's own API, so I'm going to throw in the user API. Let's try calling that. And that path is its API2, and it is user. And then we can pass it in as a query string, a username, which I'll just use one of our test subjects, LXA. Now also another great API to call is the issue picker, and issue picker API, and that is also API2, and it is issue picker. And now here we can actually no, we don't stop. We do this. We give it a query string, right? And the cool thing here is we can pass it a JQL statement. So I'm going to pass in assignee equals admin. I want to see all the tickets belong to admin. Now here we have a little bit of a problem because in this query string, it's going to try to parse it into a name and a value based on an equal sign. I have two equal signs here. So the way that, so this assignee equals admin is the entire value. And the way Jira handles this is they URI escape that. And because I do this fairly often, I know the URI escape for an equal sign is %3D. Now this whole side will be the value that will be the JQL value. So, and lastly, our BI export tool API, and that will be Get Business Intelligence Export version 1 message. So that API will give us back exports of all our Jira issues, comments, work logs, things like that within date range if we give them dates. And that's all we have for, oh, that's not all we have for configuration. That's just the URLs there. Next, we need some credentials, don't we? So there are two things I should mention here when we're talking about credentials. The first is that all these APIs that we would be calling respect issue level security, meaning that if you're the user, if the user you're logging in as cannot view the issues, they won't appear in the export results either. So you need to use a user who has credentials powerful enough to view all the issues that you want to export. I'll be using admin. I never change the defaults, and it's completely powerful. So we'll be able to see everything in there. The second thing I should mention is that we're using cookies-based authentication because we are on a private network. This traffic will only flow on our company's network, on our private network. It's not exposed to the outside internet. If you need to connect over the Wild West open internet, then you should use OAuth. And I'll put a link in the description because Atlassian has some pretty good documentation on how to set that up. So that said, let's create and populate some credential variables. Like I said, I'm using the admin credentials because those are the defaults on a fresh install of Jira. You can use your own credentials or something set up by your Jira administrator as long as it has high enough permissions to see all the issues that you want to export. I'll go back down here and login username. And for me, that is admin. And a login password. I don't know why I'm camel casing like that, but I am. And those are our credentials. Lastly, I'm going to give some API parameters here for the BI export API. And I could have suffixed these directly onto the end here like I did for our other two APIs that we'll be calling, but instead I want it to be easy to edit later on. Just go to the top of the file here where you're changing, your server address, maybe your protocol, and you'll also be able to change your credentials, and then you could change the start and end dates as well. So I'm going to put them in here. Now the start date is the first date. In fact, I'll call it analysis start date. This is the first date of the period of time over which issues will be extracted. Your report will contain any issues created or updated after midnight on this date. And if you don't enter anything at all, the default date of 1 day ago will be used. And that's because most BI exports happen kind of on a daily basis. For this one, though, I'm going to give it a nice period of time. You know what? I'm going to give it January 19. And then an analysis end date. And this is the last date of that period of time, and it'll create so your export will include any issues created or updated before 11:59:59 on this date. So if you enter nothing, the default end date of today's date will be used of midnight. So you chop it off right when the day starts, so you get yesterday's data. And for this one, I'll use 31 January 19. We'll get a whole month's worth of data here. So that's it, API. Oh, you know what else? We should specify a directory into which our CSV exports will be saved, because we'll use that later. And I'll just use a directory called downloads, so export directory. I'll call it this folder, downloads. And I'll put the closing / on that so I don't have to put that in when I'm writing the file names. And while we're doing that, let's go ahead and create a downloads directory while we're thinking about it. Okay. There we go. So that's it for configuration. A few short lines there. We've got our imports done. We've got our configurations done. I'm going to escape B and start doing something else. In fact, it's time, escape 2. There we go. Log in to Jira. Escape B for a new line. And this block of code will log into Jira using the login API and get back that response which contains our JSession ID. Also, we'll parse that JSession ID out of the response and store it in a variable, because we'll need to send it back to Jira in future requests. It'll serve as the authentication for those future requests, right? So to get started, what we need to do is create a URL to contact. So that will be our login URL. Is going to be made up of our base URL plus our login API. And with those two things in place, we have to send some data to this thing, and what it expects is a username and a password. So I'll go login data that we'll send to it is going to be JSON, and it's going to have a username, which will simply be our login user name, and then a password, which will simply be our login password, strangely camel cased. And once again, there we go. Next, we can actually make our request and get our response back. Now we're going to store that response into a response object. So I'll create one of those, and I'm going to call requests.post login URL. And as JSON data, we are sending in our login data. Next up, we might actually have some kind of error that happens when we do all this. Scroll up a bit, there we go. So if we have an error, we should check for that. If login response.status code does not equal success, which is 200, then we have an error, and we're going to raise an exception. And I'm going to send myself a little message saying I made a post request to a particular URL. That's our login URL. And then I think I want to see the status code too. Now this is an integer, so I can't just concatenate it on there. I will use the format to do that. Format login response dot status code. Okay, close that, close that. That's our exception. Now, if it was successful, then we need to parse our response. And really, there's only one thing we're interested in. It's a thing called the JSession ID. So I'll say my JSession ID is login response dot, and it comes out of the cookies object. That's how it's returned to us, and it is called JSession ID. And that's really it. There's not much going on here. We've just got a few lines of code to actually log into Jira. At the end of this, though, I would like to see my result. So I'm going to have it print out a message, just debug log, a little message to myself that contains my JSession ID. All right, let's give this a test. Run all. Login response, error, 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 400 error. Okay, we got back a 400. That's not good. That's a bad request. So let's check our base URL, login API. Those look good. Username. There we are. Username is login, username, password, login, password. That should do the trick. Run all. Aha! Our JSession ID. There it is. This is the key thing that will authenticate us when we're sending in requests for data later on. So we've saved that off into the my JSession ID, and that is really the goal for today's episode. So we've got that. In the next episode, we'll go ahead and use it to make some requests, get some data back from a few different Jira APIs, and I look forward to seeing you there. Bye.